Good morning, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. I know it can be early or late, depending on where you're joining from. Thank you for coming today to listen to another Teams developer community call. My name is Loki Meyburg. I'm one of the platform PMs on the platform team at Microsoft Teams. I've been working on single sign-on for the last few months, so I'm super excited to show this off to everyone on the call and then leave everyone with some resources so that everyone can get started. So just quickly, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to be talking about single sign-on or SSO. I'm also going to take a little trip down a memory lane to just about 2 months ago, and we can talk a little bit about how authentication worked inside of Teams in last year or up until this point. And we can talk a little bit about some of the problems that developers and users were experiencing with our current solution. And then finally, third bullet point, the one that we're all here for today, is I'm going to talk a little bit about single sign-on, what the story is today, and how you can basically get started. And I'm going to run you through a sample application at the end. I have made sacrifices to the demo gods this morning, so we're going to try to do a live demo. And the demo is basically going to take you through our sample code, how to set it up, how to register your application with Azure AD, and basically start kicking the tires. And then at the end, I'm going to just open it up for some Q&A. So about me, my name is Loki Meyburg. You can follow me on Twitter at Loki Meyburg. And yeah, I'm on the platform team. I spend a lot of time talking to developers and thinking about how we can improve our development story at Microsoft Teams. On the platform team at Microsoft Teams specifically, I own the tabs capability of apps. So apps at Microsoft Teams are divvied up into different capabilities. They range from bots to messaging extensions. And then the one that we're going to be talking about today is tabs. Another word we use for tabs is hosted experiences. So that is whenever you want to host your app experience inside of Teams. So let's talk about what's new for developers today. So today, Azure AD single sign-on is supported for Teams tabs. We are in developer preview, although I think by the time that this video gets put onto YouTube, we might actually have the feature generally available for everyone. So what is single sign-on? It lets you basically sign in your users with the same account that they're using in Teams. So the experience today is that there's no way for you to use the same identity that the user is using when they've signed into Teams. And oftentimes the user is then, they get shown a sign-in screen. Thankfully, with SSO, users never have to sign in again. No more fumbling around for your password. The best part, I think, about this feature is no more sign-in on mobile, which is a huge pain. So if you ever have to do it, you're trying to type in with your little stubby fat fingers, and you're making mistakes. You don't have to do that anymore. Sign-in is taken care of. And then I think the one that's most exciting for developers is the development experience is greatly improved when it comes to single sign-on. It really is the recommended approach moving forward for developers whenever they think about authentication or building authentication into their application. Let's talk about SSO. So a little trip down memory lane. Let's look at what the story was like last year. So we've always supported authentication for developers inside of Microsoft Teams, but the biggest constraint, I would say, was that all of our authentication was cookie-based. So one of the good things about cookie-based authentication is it's well understood. It's often implemented already in a lot of the applications today, or the web applications today. But along with cookie-based authentication, you get the usual caveats. Cookies expire. Cookies don't move from your browser to your desktop to your mobile device. So just because you're signed in on Teams in the desktop client doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be signed in on your phone. We've supported this thing. We called it silent SSO. If you remember the old documentation, I think we still call it silent auth. We kind of call it faux SSO. It's still cookie-based. What this provided us was it provided us with the ability to make the user experience better, but I don't know if it necessarily improved the developer experience. Silent Auth basically allowed a Azure AD application inside of Teams the ability to quickly pop up a sign-up window, do the auth exchange, drops a cookie, and then it quickly closes the window. So from the user's experience, what they would have seen was they go to your application, they're not signed in. Sometimes they have to click a button. You could invoke that yourself. Then the user is presented with a quick little pop-up window. The window appears for maybe 1 to 2 to maybe 3 seconds, and then the window's closed down. And all that exchange did was it generated a authentication cookie for the user. We have really good sample code available for this. My opinion is that it's quite heavy-handed for a developer to get silent authentication working. I tried it out a few weeks ago, and I remember it being quite cumbersome to get working properly. And the experience to the end user was just a small little improvement for quite a lot of work. And I think, all of this can be summed up as, we listen to our developers quite a lot. We talk to our MVPs, talk to them at conferences. Authentication is definitely one of the top, maybe top 3 complaints we hear from developers all the time, is that not only is authentication difficult to get working properly, but once you get it working, the experience to the end user is still, it's not, it's a little lackluster. It's not the best experience to the end user. So, for the visual people out there, this is kind of what the experience would look like to the user. The user comes in, they see the start screen, they click sign in. They're then asked to consent and provide permission for that access, and then they're signed in. Now, that experience seems fine. That experience hasn't changed too much with SSO, but really it's the sometime later part of the slide that really sucks for users. Sometime later, the user is going to close Teams, they're going to sign out, and they're going to come back to Teams, and they're going to go back to their favorite app, and sure enough, they're not signed in anymore. Now, that could happen for a few reasons. Either Teams just tossed the cookie out, and you have to generate a new cookie, or the cookie expired, and this application hadn't done anything to get a new cookie generated for the user. And then, as for some of the developers who've been following, we've slowly rolling out apps onto mobile. And for any developers who are serving users who are mobile first, this experience is just terrible. So not only are they signed in on desktop, they're not signed in on their phone. They have to then go back to their phone, sign in again, and you can imagine fumbling through your username, your password. If you have two-factor authentication, you have to go through that additional step as well. And then sure enough, that person's going to come back to their phone in a few days, go back to their favorite app, and they're going to find that they're no longer signed in. So all in all, it's a passable solution. It wasn't great. It's definitely something that we wanted to improve. And so I guess, yeah, we've heard you loud and clear. Single sign-on couldn't come fast enough. We've been working on it in conjunction with the Azure AD team to provide you guys with a solution that not only makes this whole experience better, it improves predominantly this experience here is greatly improved, and the developer experience is improved too. Let's just look through some, what would be the common needs of the personas for single sign-on? Well, for the end user, it's pretty simple. They just want to skip sign in. They don't want to do it anymore. They've already signed into Teams. Why do they have to sign into their app as well? And why do they have to keep doing it over and over and over again? The chief complaint from developers is building authentication is just a terribly difficult ordeal to go through. It's really difficult to get right. It's very brittle. Anything that we could do to improve the developer experience would be great. From IT admins, we hear a lot of complaints around conditional access policies. So specifically, I'm talking about conditional access policies that are device specific. So if users are only allowed to access an app through a specific device, or their device has to be domain joined or Intune enrolled, our current solution today gets you some of the conditional access policies, but not all of them. So we hear frequently from IT admins that they just want better security controls over the line of business applications that run inside of Teams. So in comes Teams and Azure AD. This has kind of been a partnership between the two orgs at Microsoft to provide you guys with an SSO solution. So what that looks like today is that developers are able to build authentication using Azure AD. As a bonus, they're going to get faster load times as well. Something we do is as soon as the user clicks on the application and they navigate to that tab, before the tab is finished loading, we've already gone to Azure AD and asked them to give us an authentication token. That way, when you ask for it, it's already going to be available to give to you. Oftentimes you'll see me now, I'm going to go through the sample setup. It's going to be a little slow the very first time you access a brand new application, but those tokens are cached. So we're going to be giving it to you right from cache, and we're going to be getting that token before the tab is even finished loading. Much easier development. It's only about 5, maybe 7 lines of code for basic authentication. It works on desktop and mobile. And finally, it supports all the conditional access policies as well. So finally, what that experience looks like is that the user only has to consent once. So here you're seeing the sample that I'm going to run you through. We present you with a nice, call it a speed bump page, just to let the user know that they're almost there. They just have to click continue. We pop up a window. The user consents once to these permissions, and that's it. The user won't have to consent ever again. Every time the user comes back to this tab, they're going to be automatically signed in. Let's just quickly take a look at that. We've got my lovely sample app called TaskMeow, which is one of the little sample apps that me and my team work on quite frequently. I'm going to go to My Tasks and give it a second. And there you go. This is the first experience. You're going to see you're basically being asked for consent, and that's it. That's the consent experience. I'm going to just quickly consent to this and accept. And you'll see it's just asking for basic profile information. And voila, now I'm signed into the application. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to my Planner app. I'm going to go back to TaskMeow. I'm going to go to My Tasks. And voila, you see I'm instantly in. Didn't have to do anything extra after that step. Just one more time quick. I'm going to go to chat, back to the bot, back to the app, and voila, I'm in instantly. It's a really, really nice experience. Now, if I were to go and use TaskMeow on my phone, because I've already consented on my desktop machine, I'm going to get the exact same experience. I'm going to be immediately signed in. I'm not going to see that consent screen because I've already consented once for TaskMeow to have access to my email address and name, and then also for TaskMeow to get a authentication token for me. One of the other things as well that I just want to talk about, you'll see this, TaskMeow needs your consent in order to do this work. The first part of the experience where I consented and I was able to sign in, that's for authentication. So the solution that I'm going to be showing you today is great for authentication. It's not so good for authorization. So we can authorize you for some very basic permissions, enough to authenticate the user. If you want additional permissions, in this case, what this is going to ask for is it just wants permission to show my profile photo. If you want access to the user's profile photo, or you want access to the user's mail or calendar or any of those other graph scopes, you are going to have to do a little bit of extra work. Well, it's the same work you would have done before, but you need to then present another screen to the user, and then in this screen, they're going to say, hey, this app wants access to mail or to calendar or to, in this case, your profile photo. Now, most applications will find that for most of their needs, authentication is exactly what they want. They just want to authenticate the user, get a token, get them in, and then once they're authenticated, they handle all of the UI and the rest of the experience from there. So that'll be fine for them. Now, there are some other applications that do need access to calendar or mail.read, some of these other graph scopes. Most of those applications we've found are line of business applications, and you can actually circumvent all of that by having a tenant admin just pre-approve the application, especially if it's a line of business app. Just pre-approve the app, and then that experience that I just went through, you're never going to have to do that experience to your users because your users will already be pre-consented. So here you see my profile photo just showed up. So those users will be pre-consented for those permissions. But in the very, very rare chance that you're looking to ship an application and you don't want tenant admin consent, in other words, it's not a line of business application, and you want access to calendar or mail.read, we do provide you with a workaround on how to get those permissions. So, you just saw in this example, I didn't have my profile photo at first, and that second flow was for me to just get my profile photo. So again, for authentication, SSO is fantastic. For authorization, We could be doing a little bit of improvement in the authentication experience. However, I'm going to walk you through what that workaround looks like. It's very similar to what we already do today or recommend for users today. So let's just quickly talk about the song and dance. For anyone who's familiar with OAuth, they should be pretty familiar with this experience. What's not shown in this diagram is that the Tab app has to go into Azure AD and approve the Teams app as a trusted client to get a token essentially on their behalf. So the Tab app is going to ask Teams, say, Teams, hey, please, can you go give me a token? Teams is then going to go and probably have to consent at first, right? So the user hasn't consented, and so that's going to be the first experience, is the user has to consent. Once the user's consented and the Tab app asks Teams app for a token, Teams is going to go just straight to Azure AD. It's going to get the token from Azure AD, return it back to Teams, and then we are going to pass that back to you. That token in this exchange is going to be your authentication token. It's going to come with your email address and a token you can use to authenticate that user. If you need additional graph permissions, this is for the authorization part of the experience, it's going to be your responsibility to take that token that we've passed back to you and pass it back to your server and do something called an on behalf of exchange. Basically, you're going to exchange that token server side for additional graph permissions. And if you remember back to the example that I just showed you, if you try to go and exchange it and AD says, no, that the user hasn't consented yet to say mail access or to the avatar photo, your server-side app should tell your client app to present a little banner to the user and say, hey, we just need some further permissions before you can fully use the application. So let's just quickly talk about some of the steps that you would go through. One of the first steps is you're going to have to go to Azure AD, and you're going to go to the app registration portal and just register your application. In that registration experience, you're going to register your app. The example that I'm going to show you is going to be the full registered application type, where it'll accept any AED user as well as anyone using a consumer Microsoft account. However, for those of you who are familiar, SSO does work with the other two options as well. Once you're done that, you're going to get an app ID, store that somewhere because you're going to need that when you come back to Teams. You need to expose an API. So we need to have some API that we can talk to your application for. And the way that works is you're going to have to put your fully qualified domain name and your app ID that you got in this step here. Oh, and you need to add a scope. So it'll be your fully qualified domain name / whatever your app ID is / access as user. That's going to be your scope. Finally, you want to just authorize the Teams application. We have two apps or two app IDs. We have the client ID for the desktop and mobile apps, and then we also have another client ID for the actual Teams web app. So you need to tell Azure AD that you give Teams permission to get a token for your application. Back into Teams, with those properties that you got from the first step, you need to go and update your manifest. In the manifest, we provide a property called the web application info section. And in here is where you're going to put all of your web app information that you got from Azure AD. The first one is going to be your app ID. And then the second one is going to be the resource. So if I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. This whole piece here is going to be your resource. That tells us where, what resources we're going to be asking permission for, and that has to go here. I'll show you how to do that. And then finally, from a developer perspective, it's quite nice actually. You just call get auth token, and we have a success and a failure callback, and that's it for the most part. Actually, that'll give you a token. The tricky part is going to be if you get the token back and you want to do more stuff with that token. So I'll show you how you can do more stuff with that token as well. But yeah, basically this will be the development experience for a developer. It's quite nice. It's much simpler, and that gives you a token that you can use right away. And we'll take care of this UI experience for you as well, so you don't have to do that. So yeah, let's look at a demo first. So I'm gonna run you guys through.
Loki, before
Yeah.
Before we do that,
Sure.
there are a couple questions. Is this a good time, or do you want to wait until the end?
Yeah, let's answer some of these questions.
Okay, there's just a few. The first one was, will these tabs also use the primary refresh token, PRT
That's
in Windows 10?
ooh, I don't. You will get a refresh token. I don't know if it's the primary refresh token. Um,
Okay,
yeah,
we can find that out.
yeah, we can find that.
Okay, and then I'm not exactly sure where this came in, but does it log you into Teams Web as well?
That's a really good question. Yes, it'll work on both the desktop application as well as the web application.
Okay. Perfect. And then what happens with the integration of Graph API for which the token expires in sometimes does it auto refresh?
No, it'll be your responsibility to refresh that token using the refresh token that's provided back to you.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. These are good questions. Okay, and then is authorization consent done once or is it cached?
Oh, that's a good question. Authorization consent is done once. It's cached is maybe a misnomer here. Essentially, what's happening is we're writing a record of consent to Azure AD. That record of consent basically is a record stating that the user has consented, and therefore the user will never have to consent for those permissions again. Now, if you change those permissions, the user is going to have to consent again because those permissions are different. But as long as you keep the permissions the same, the user won't have to consent a second time.
And then we'll do a couple more and then we'll move on to the demo and then and then we can answer some more questions. So does anyone ever notice that if you make a Teams app and you load a website into a tab within the app, not adding a site tab to a team, SSO fails to load properly, as in the actual SSO page fails to load? Wondering if this will help address that issue at all.
That is a really, really good question, and as I'm hearing the question, I'm realizing I probably should have had a slide about that because yes, that is a really big problem today when you just load a website and you expect it to work the same way that it would if it were just a browser tab, and unfortunately, this solution does not address that problem or that it doesn't address that problem. So for those of you on the call who are unfamiliar with it, if I go and take a regular website, let's say it's Pinterest.com, and I just load Pinterest.com as a tab. Maybe I go and create my own manifest, and I just take the Pinterest.com URL and I put it right in. Will this solution mean that I don't have to sign in to Pinterest? Pretend Pinterest had Azure AD support. Can they not just use my Azure AD account? The answer to that, unfortunately, is no. The reason for that is that Pinterest has to do work to integrate with our SDK. So there's no guarantee that Pinterest has used our SDK to get a token. And secondly, if you're just doing this as a generic website tab, in other words, you're not building a custom app, we are actually not allowed to communicate with that website for both security and privacy reasons. So when you use the website tab, that'll always be a really funky sign-in experience where your sign-in cookie is only really remembered for the session for while you have Teams open. So no, this solution that I'm talking about is not about generic website tabs or specifically websites that you do not own. What I'm talking about today is for applications that you are developing that you own, we can provide you with a better authentication story for your users. So that was a really good question.
That's awesome. Okay, two more we'll do, and then we'll go on to the demo, and then we'll hold those to the questions to the end. Can we pass this authentication token to a bot so we don't have to log in from the bot as well?
Oh, that is a really good question. And yes, you can do that. Back in December, I tried to do it. It's possible. You can absolutely do it. We just don't have a sample to show anyone. But if you know how to do that, it's possible. That token will be good for the bot as well.
Okay, great. And will Gmail accounts now be supported?
Good question. Unfortunately not. So this single sign-on solution, I guess this is kind of jumping to one of my last slides, which talks a little bit about constraints. This single sign-on solution is just with Azure AD. This is not for other providers like Google or Facebook This is just about Azure AD SSO.
Great.
So unfortunately, this isn't a solution for like Google Auth, unfortunately.
Sounds good. All right, we'll move on to the demo. Keep typing your questions in. These are fabulous questions, and we'll get to more at the end.
Okay, so let's get started with the demo. Actually, before I start, just some of the resources I'm going to be using. These are the docs that I will be referencing from time to time. These are our SSO docs, and then this is just the sample that I will be using. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, we have documentation on how to use SSO, and I'll be coming back to this page a few times just to get some of this information while we're setting this up. So yeah, let's get started with the demo. One of the first things before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. In order for you to do any kind of local development when it comes to authentication, you're going to need a publicly exposed URL. So unfortunately, localhost is not going to work. We recommend that developers sign up for ngrok. ngrok is a local tunneling service, and it'll give you a public domain name that you can use for this type of testing. So for today's demo, I've gone and created contoso auth.ngrok.io. So I'm just going to take this, and I'm going to just save this up here. We're gonna just come back to this little document here as we're collecting information as we go. So first things first, let's just go back to the home screen. You're wanting to go to Azure Active Directory, and you want to go to app registrations. New app, Contoso Teams off. And we're going to choose the most featureful account type. And over here, we're going to just put our ngrok account. By the way, all of these steps are pretty well documented in the actual sample itself. So if you go and look at the sample, all of the steps that I'm going through are pretty well documented. You just follow those steps in the README, and that should be enough. Let me just double check this URL auth end. Auth end. Okay, perfect. So yeah, you just need to set a redirect URI. You don't have to do it in this step. You can always do it in the next step. This is the URL that Azure AD will redirect to after the user has authenticated. So one of the first things you want to do is just copy your app ID over here. Okay. Got the app ID, and let's just go through each of these little ones down here. We can skip branding. Let's go straight to authentication. So we've already set our redirect URI. Make sure to set implicit grant to both access tokens and ID tokens. Save that. Certificates and secrets. You don't need to do this step if all you're looking for is just to authenticate the user. But if you want to do additional authorization workflows, like getting access to the user's calendar or the user's mail, you're going to need a secret for this little step. So do this. Teams, developer community, call secret. And I'm going to copy this and throw that in there. Okay, API permissions. Okay, let's add some permissions. Graph, delegated permissions, and I'm just going to select all of these. Now we're going to give you access to a few of these, and then I've included one extra one to get the user's profile photo. You'll see what that looks like in the sample. I'm going to expose an API. I'm going to add a scope. Okay, so let's not screw this part up. Let's go here, do this, slash. So if you remember back to my slides, you always want to put your fully qualified domain name out here. And I think that's going to be my application URI, save and continue. And then the scope that I want to add is going to be access underscore as underscore user. So access as user. Give us access to everyone. Lorem ipsum. And make sure that it's enabled. So add the scope. So this is going to be the endpoint that we're going to be pinging to get access to some of those permissions that we configured in the previous step. Okay, so all of this is fine and dandy, but we need to tell Azure that we are going to give permission to the Teams applications. So here they are. This is the ID for the Teams mobile and desktop app, and here's the ID for the Teams web app. So we need to tell Azure that we give these apps permission to access this scope. So I'm going to throw it here and give it permission to that scope. Okay. Same thing here. Give it access, add. Great. And that's it, I think, as far as setting up your Azure AD app is concerned. So just to recap, make sure you have a redirect URI set up and you've enabled these two implicit grant checkboxes. Make sure you've generated a secret. Copy paste that secret somewhere into a file because you're going to need it again. API permissions, set all of the graph scopes that you want access to over here. The ones that I picked for this demo is email, offline access, OpenID, profile, and user.read. Finally, you want to expose a scope, call that scope access as user, and we granted the Teams desktop and web application and mobile application permission to ping this API endpoint. Okay, so now with all of that information, first thing we want to do is go to the manifest. And in the manifest, everywhere where it says ngrok subdomain, remember that's the subdomain you got from ngrok over here, the little subdomain that I just set up for this demo. I'm going to replace that with the subdomain that I've got, which is contoso auth. Yep. Replace all. And then go all the way down to the web application info section and take your app ID, which you got here in this step, and just set your app ID this, and again over here. Okay, so that's everything you need to get set up for your manifest. But there's one more file in the sample where we have some environment variables that we need to set. And I'm just going to set my app ID here. And then finally, we have that secret that we generated that I'm going to just take here and throw into here. Now, fingers crossed. First thing we want to do is we want to start up ngrok. So you'll notice that for ngrok, what I'm doing is I'm binding to port 3333, and I'm binding to the subdomain contoso auth, which is that subdomain that I set up in the very beginning. And that's going to set up a local tunnel for me. The next thing you want to do is just make sure you run gulp generate manifest. This is going to take all of this manifest changes that you made, and it's just going to bundle them into this little zip file that we're going to upload to Teams. Perfect. Okay. Next thing we want to do is we want to go to Teams. Let's see, where is it? Here. I'm going to go to the App Store. I'm going to upload a custom app for myself. That's that manifest that we just created. Upload, add. And this shouldn't work because I haven't started the server yet, but let's see if we get the ngrok error page. Perfect. So this is the ngrok error page. Let's come back here and run the server. Oh, and everyone on the call, cross your fingers so that this goes smoothly. Okay, so that should be up and running now. If I go back here and I go to auth tab, and it should be loading up from my local server. Perfect. Okay, so in this little sample, there's a bunch of debug code that'll get spat out. And one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to call that get auth token call and present the user with a little speed bump page, just letting them know that, hey, in the next step, we're going to ask you for permission. Part of the reason we decided to do this step was before we had this step, what would happen is the app would call get auth token, and if the user hadn't consented, the app would just pop open a consent screen for the user. So not only is that scary sometimes, because if you've seen the AAD consent screen, it can be quite formal, but also we noticed that a lot of users would end up not being able to find the window because the window would just pop up on some random screen somewhere. So this is a nice way to let the user know, hey, once you click continue, something's going to happen, and you're probably going to have to consent. So let's do this quick. And wait for the consent screen to pop up. Okay, so asking for some basic info. And voila, I'm in. So let's just pause here for a second. That was the entire step for the user to be able to authenticate the user. And this is the token that we got back. Let's just explode this token open inside of, by the way, this is a great URL, jwt.io, if you want to just take a peek at your tokens. So I just copied and pasted the token out there. It's going to decode the token for me. And in here, you can see my name, see my email address. You can see that scope that we were asking for, access as user. And so yeah, so this token here is all that you're going to need to authenticate the user. Now, for most apps, that's all you need. You just needed to go through that little experience, get this token, and that'll be all you need to authenticate the user. And that would be it. That would be me closing up the demo, saying SSO is done. However, we do know that other developers want access to additional graph scopes. So if I go back to here, if I were to go to API permissions and I wanted access to more stuff, like I really wanted access to the user's mail, I might want to be able to, I might want access to mail.read, right? So how can I take this token and exchange it so that I can get access to these elevated permissions? Well, in the sample, once we notice that happens, we then show this grant further permissions button. In your UI, it'll be very similar to that task meow example that I showed earlier. You just put a soft banner into your application that says, hey, we need additional permissions from you. Once you grant these further permissions, the screen is going to ask for those additional permissions. I'm going to accept. And here I get a much more complete token back that now gives me access, in this case, to the user's profile photo. I know that's a pretty contrived example, but you can imagine that this token can also give you elevated permissions for mail access or calendar access. Please keep in mind that most enterprises have actually blocked access to those types of permissions. So if that's the case, be sure to handle those experiences inside of your UI, or consider something called tenant admin consent, where you essentially ask the tenant admins to pre-consent that application for all of their users. Let's just quickly go back to chat and go back to auth tab. You see how quickly that was for me to authenticate the user. I quickly send the token back for exchange, and I get back a new token, elevated permissions. So this one here is going to be what 90% of all developers are going to want. This is the one that's going to authenticate the user. Once I got this token back, I send it back for exchange, and I get back another token that gives me much greater permission, in this case, to access the user's profile photo. That's it. That's it for the demo. I wish I could show you guys the mobile experience for this, but I don't know how to hook up my phone to be able to show you guys. I wasn't able to do that in time this morning. But if I were to visit my authentication sample on my phone, all of this will just be taken care of for me. I don't see a consent screen. I don't have to sign in anymore. I'm basically just automatically signed in. And I think one of the things I wanted to do is I just want to talk a little bit about what the code looks like for this. So in the sample, there is this auth.js file that I've created. The auth.js file, really the bulk of the work, the one that most people are going to be interested in, is going to be this function right here, getAuthToken. This one calls getAuthToken. It has a success callback and a failed callback. The success callback, in this case, because I want extra permissions, most applications are not going to send their token to the backend for exchange. But in this case, I am. And I've just outlined, for anyone who's done this before, this should be pretty familiar. I'm basically just sending the token to the backend for exchange. If, for whatever reason, the user hasn't consented to these additional permissions, the third step is basically just to initialize a consent button. In your case, it'll be a soft little banner that tells the user, hey, can you please consent to these additional permissions? On the actual server side, if you were to do this exchange work for this step over here, where you're doing the backend exchange, there's a file called tabs.js, and you can see what that server-side token exchange looks like. It's pretty gnarly, but this basically will do the exchange and get back a elevated token for you. Again, most people will not be worried about this additional work. this first function over here is all that you're going to need to be able to authenticate your user. And that's it as far as the demo goes.
Oh, it's great. We have
sure,
a couple questions on that.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that, Chris.
All right. Someone asked the question about bots. I know you don't have a sample, but can you talk through differences of how to implement this in bots?
Oh, okay. So, right off the bat, this SSO work, and it was kind of the title of the talk as well. This is just for tabs, and this is specifically just for tabs and Azure AD. So I didn't talk about bots, and the reason I didn't talk about bots is because while you can use this for bots today, in other words, you can get the bot to present a screen, and that screen gets you the token. It's not true bot SSO. True bot SSO would imply that I go to the bot and I'm just automatically logged in. I don't have to click a button. I don't have to do any of that work. So for that SSO, bot SSO, we're actively working on right now, and I can't really talk too much about timelines or details, but true bot SSO is something that we're working on today. However, if you wanted to use this for some authentication experience for bots, you could have the bot present a card that says sign in. The user clicks sign in, and when you sign in, that sign in experience opens up this. It just opens up this screen, and this screen will be the screen that handles all of the token exchange for that specific bot. And once you get this token back, you can pass this token back to the bot. It's not true bot SSO because the user still has to largely interact with that experience. However, you could get pretty close using this for bots. We will be making some further improvements and changes to this so that the SSO experience for tabs is very similar for the SSO experience for bots in the future. So thank you. That was a good question.
Okay, and he said, got it. The card experience is what I was thinking, so thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, let's see. There was one more question on the bot side. To send this token to a bot, can we pass it to Microsoft Teams.authentication.notify success?
Oh, yes, you can. You can pass that back. So let me, just for the people on the call, let me. It is possible. I haven't published the sample yet, but you will be calling notify success and passing that token back. That is correct. So I'm probably not going to find this in time on this call. So yeah, just trust me on that one. Call notify success, and then you pass that token back to the bot.
Okay, great. And then one more question. Instead of showing on your mobile, could you open a separate browser private mode, maybe?
Oh, instead of showing on the browser, show on my phone. I'm sorry, I don't know what the question is implying.
If you want to expand on that, we can figure out if there's something we can do there. Oh, let's see. The documentation says it's only supported in developer preview. Do we have an idea of GA for SSO?
Yes, we do. So that's a good question. So yes, we're only in developer preview today. However, by the end of this month, fully rolled out on desktop. But it'll only then be in developer preview on mobile. So we will be making a formal announcement to say, hey, SSO is generally available. And what that would mean is that SSO is generally available on both desktop and on mobile. But in the interim, what we're going to do is we're going to fully roll this out on desktop over the next 2 to 3 weeks. It will be fully available on desktop, so your users can use this end-to-end on desktop. And then during that rollout, it'll then be available as developer preview on mobile. So some of your people can start testing it on mobile. However, we don't expect it to be fully released on mobile until the end of this quarter. So yes, we are looking to roll this out on desktop fairly soon so that you can start having your users use this out in the wild. That's it.
Okay, great. And then, yes, these slides will be published, including the recording. I'm posting the link again to the YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to that channel, and you'll get updates to recordings that are being posted. You can see other community calls as well as the Teams calls, and there's training videos and a whole bunch of other stuff for developers on that channel. So I think it's great. And then you can also follow us on our Microsoft 365 Twitter handle, and I'll put that in the IM chat as well. And that's where we post all of our announcements, reminders about calls, when recordings are available, and all. You can kind of get everything through that as well. So I'll put both of those links in the IM chat in just a second. One more question.
No.
Lots of questions here. Not sure if this is the right forum to ask deployment related questions, but is there any centralized deployment functionality available for Microsoft custom apps?
That's a good question. I'll have to get back to that person and dig into that a little bit more. I know that we're working on something at the moment on two fronts to make it so that IT admins have a much better experience when they're deploying applications throughout Microsoft Teams, but I'm not sure if that'll directly be the answer that this person's looking for, and it's also not my area of expertise, so maybe we can follow up with that person offline.
Yep, we can definitely do that. And then one last question for the server side, are there samples in .NET?
Oh, that's a really good question. Not yet, but we're working on it.
Okay, great.
Oh, and I should add to that, though. Yeah, we're working on it. I believe that there are already C# examples of how to do a server-side on behalf of Exchange, but I don't have a sample in the context of SSO. However, I would imagine that code doesn't change dramatically from the samples that we have today. So I'm sure if that individual just went looking through some of our authentication samples, I believe that there's a C# example out there, and in there they can go spelunking and find the backend code for what that server-side on behalf of Exchange should look like. Okay. Thanks for all the questions, everyone. Those were really good questions. Yeah, I think one of the key things just to take that I'm thinking about the questions, this SSO experience is just for tabs, and it's specifically focused on Azure AD. So don't expect it to work for Google Auth. Don't expect it to work for any random website that you just start pinning. This is specifically for developers who are building apps or have an existing app that they're looking to integrate into Teams, and they're looking to build the authentication piece to their application. And the way that we recommend they do that is in conjunction with Azure AD by registering an application and going through that whole flow that you saw me doing earlier. Just a few closing points. I want to talk a little bit about some of the constraints, some of the architectural constraints. These are pretty important to know about. Some of them are temporary, but they will probably affect you for the next few weeks. So I just wanted to call them out. Again, it's probably a good thing to sound like a broken record on this one, but this only works for Azure Active Directory. So we don't support Google Auth for this specific workflow. We do have samples on how to make Google Auth, LinkedIn Auth, and all the other auth providers work. However, those will not be true single sign-on experiences inside of Teams. So this is specifically about taking the user account that the user is logged into Teams with. So if they're logged into Teams as a student using their campus email address, that's the identity that we're going to be using to sign the user into your application with. Another important constraint is you notice me today setting up ngrok and using that as the domain name that I was running my application off of. But I had to do two things. I had to provide my domain name in both my manifest down here, but I also had to serve my application. Where's my static tabs? I had to serve the application from that very same domain name. So it's very important that your domain names match. You know, if I have an app called contoso.com, I need to make sure that I'm calling getAuth token from contoso.com, and I need to make sure that I've registered that domain name inside of Azure AD. And the reason we do that is because we need to make sure that you own that domain. Obviously, if you're able to start making SDK calls from that domain, that's proof that you own it. But it is important because some people's applications exist at a domain name that's separate from their URI that their AD app's running at. So that's a very important constraint, something to keep aware of. The third one, I think this is mostly for line of business developers, but Today, we don't currently support the Azure websites.net domain. The Azure AD team explained to us that this was for security purposes. However, we are working with the AD team to have this specific restriction removed. So in the short term, don't use Azure websites.net. The reason for that is because you might be registered at a domain name like contoso.azurewebsites.net. And since it's free, you probably only use it for a few weeks or a few months, and then you no longer use it anymore. Someone else comes in to Azure websites, they see that Contoso is now available, the domain, they take it, and they've essentially, through this entire exchange, they could take ownership of your AD app ID, or your app in this case. So for security reasons, Azure Websites has been blacklisted. However, we are working with them on getting that specific restriction removed. Finally, SSO is great for authentication. Like if you want to authenticate your user, it's just a few lines of JavaScript after you've registered your application in Azure AD, and you're off to the races. To get authorization working, it is a little bit of extra work. You need to do a token exchange server side. For anyone who's done this before, it's hopefully old hat at this point, but it is going to be your responsibility to exchange that token to get downstream resources. You know, the sample that I was showing earlier shows you how to do that. Just something to keep in mind. When we give you back that token, we're only giving you basic permissions, the user's email address, and an auth token, basically, and that's it. We don't provide you with mail access or calendar access with that token. And then finally, mobile is not supported yet. As soon as mobile rolls out into developer preview, we'll be rolling the desktop code out to the general public. And then once mobile is available to the general public, we'll be making a general availability announcement. So we're staggering mobile and desktop by about a month, but just something to keep in mind. Mobile is not supported yet. I tested it out the other day on mobile. It worked great in the alpha build, but just something to keep in mind. I think you know, since we have everyone here, I think today the get off token call will work on mobile. It just won't ask for consent. So as long as the user has consented on desktop, then the get off token call will provide a token back for them on mobile. But if the user hasn't consented yet, then that experience might be a little bit broken. You can imagine that what you would do in that case is provide the old school consent experience where you're getting the user to consent using a cookie-based approach. So some of the resources. I've already showed you the first two. It's the SSO docs and then the SSO sample. Go to these, rewatch this video, try to do what I did and get it set up on your machine. And that should get you a really nice sample setup to show you how SSO works. I also just wanted to talk about this URL. I keep coming back to it. When you're doing development, actually here. So you can imagine I've just consented now, and I want to rerun this experience, but I don't want to be consented anymore. Where do I go for that? So there is a URL called myapplications.microsoft.com. And in here, you can see all of the apps that you have consented to. Since we just went through this together, I should be able to go and find that Contoso app that I created and be able to revoke its access. Because I think this is something that when you're developing this, you're probably going to want to know, how do I find the apps that I've consented to, and how do I revoke that consent? So go here, Contoso. There you go. So this is the app we use today. If I wanted to revoke permissions, I go to manage the application, and these are the permissions that I've consented to. I just click revoke permissions, and it'll revoke all the permissions for me. It takes a bit of a while. It takes maybe 20 minutes sometimes for your permissions to be fully revoked. But once that's revoked, you can then rerun through this experience as if though you've never consented before. Finally, just a little plug for all of the other developer community calls. We have ones for adaptive cards, graph, identity. Today's one is for Teams, Office add-ins, Power Apps, SharePoint, and then just general development as well for SharePoint. Probably very familiar with Besa and the SharePoint community. I think for this specific call, for the people who are here, definitely the graph and the identity calls are pretty close to the material that I presented today. So if you want to know more about identity and graph permissions, highly recommend you check these two out. And that's it. Recording will be available. The next call will be on March 17th. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for all those great questions. I think maybe, Dana, if there are any other last-minute questions.
There were just a couple of things. One was Is the next call focused on bot and adaptive cards supported in Teams? And I said we could work on that topic. So
I know the people to go and poke for that. So
exactly. So we'll definitely work on that, and then we'll also post what that agenda will be. And then there was one more thing that I remember there was a requirement to publish tab app that should support sign out. However, with this flow, does the user need the sign out button, not need the sign out button?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would imagine in this experience, no, you don't need to sign out. No. But that is something that I will run up a flagpole. I will go talk to our app validation team and make sure that they're aware of that. You don't need to provide that logout experience. I don't believe so anyway. At least some of the internal apps that we've been piloting haven't provided one. But I'd always treat the validation documentation as the source of truth. So until those have been updated and until I've checked with the validation team, for now, let's just treat it like you're supposed to have some logout experience of some kind inside of your application. I will ask them to check on that. And if any changes are made, the documentation will be updated for that. That's a good question.
Sounds great. So look for the recording, follow us on Twitter, and we will see you in March. Thank you for all your questions and for joining the call today.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dana. And thanks, everyone on the call. Bye.